Gregory Fields was no ordinary millionaire. Known for his sharp intellect and unapologetic outspokenness, he had built his fortune through bold business ventures and an unwavering belief in his own abilities. Gregory was a man of logic, a staunch advocate of reason over faith. To him, religion was a crutch for the weak, a relic of a bygone era that humanity had outgrown. He had no qualms about expressing this opinion, whether on television interviews, at exclusive dinners, or on his widely followed social media platforms. His arrogance was legendary, and it was this arrogance that brought him to the steps of St. Mary's Church on an otherwise peaceful Sunday morning. That morning, the air around the church was filled with the familiar hum of hymns, the gentle rustling of prayer books, and the quiet reverence of a congregation gathered to celebrate Mass. For the faithful, this was a sanctuary, a place where they could find solace and strength in their shared belief. But for Gregory, it was a stage. Clad in a tailored suit that screamed power and wealth, he strode into the church as though he owned the place. His entrance alone was enough to disrupt the flow of the service. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire, and even the priest paused mid-sentence. The congregation recognized him immediately. Gregory's face was plastered all over television and billboards. His presence, as commanding as his reputation, was polarizing. Why was he here? Was this some sort of publicity stunt? The questions lingered unspoken as Gregory approached the altar with the confident stride of a man who believed he had nothing to fear, not from God, not from man. Reaching the front, Gregory turned to face the congregation. The priest, Father Michael, stood frozen, unsure of how to react. It wasn't every day that an infamous atheist barged into his church disrupting Mass. Gregory raised a hand demanding silence, though the murmurs had already faded into a heavy, expectant hush. "I'm here today," Gregory began, his voice strong and clear, "not to disrupt your rituals, but to issue a challenge." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "I've heard your prayers, your proclamations of faith, your belief in an all-powerful God who supposedly controls the universe, and I've decided, right here, right now, I will challenge him." Gasps rippled through the pews. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others clasped their hands tighter in prayer. Gregory smirked, clearly enjoying the effect of his words. "If your God is real," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "then let him prove it. Strike me down, send a sign, do whatever he's capable of. I'll wait." The silence was deafening. Even Father Michael seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by Gregory's raised hand. "No interruptions, Father. Let your God speak for himself." For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that makes every small sound, a cough, a shuffle, a sigh, feel magnified. Gregory stood at the altar, arms crossed, his smirk growing wider with each passing second of apparent inaction from above. To him, this was proof enough. He turned back to the priest. "Well?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "Nothing? No bolts of lightning? No booming voice from the heavens? Perhaps he's shy?" Father Michael finally stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "Mr. Fields," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this is a house of worship, not a stage for your theatrics. Faith is not about demanding signs or proving power. It is about—" Gregory interrupted, raising his voice. "Faith is about believing in something without evidence, and that's exactly why I'm here, to expose this farce for what it is. I'm giving your God a chance to prove himself, and yet, nothing." The congregation was frozen, torn between anger, fear, and disbelief. For the devout, this was more than a man questioning their beliefs. It was a direct affront to the divine, an act of blasphemy unfolding in their sacred space. Some lowered their heads in silent prayer, their lips moving rapidly as they begged for forgiveness on Gregory's behalf. Others couldn't tear their eyes away from the scene, their hands clutching rosaries as though to anchor themselves in their faith. Father Michael's voice cut through the silence again, steadier this time. Mr. Fields, faith is not something that can be proven or disproven in an instant. It is a journey, a relationship, and... Gregory threw up his hands in exasperation. Spare me the sermons, Father. I didn't come here for vague platitudes. I came for action, for proof. If your God is as powerful as you claim, he should have no problem showing himself right here, right now. The priest stared at him, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. God is not a puppet to be controlled by our demands, Mr. Fields, but I do believe he is here, even if you choose not to see him. Gregory scoffed, stepping back to address the congregation directly. Do you all hear this? Your leader is making excuses because nothing is happening. You're all clinging to an illusion, a comforting lie. At that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable, the weight of Gregory's words pressing down on everyone present. The faithful whispered silent prayers, pleading for a response, for some sign that their belief wasn't in vain. And then, just as Gregory prepared to declare victory, something happened that no one could explain. The room was charged with an uneasy energy. Gregory's words hung in the air, a bold challenge that seemed to echo endlessly in the minds of everyone present. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the faint hum of the church's overhead lights and the distant creak of wooden pews as people shifted uncomfortably. Gregory stood tall at the altar, arms crossed and smirking, a living embodiment of defiance. His confidence was palpable, his demeanor one of smug triumph as if he had already won. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The air grew heavier, not in an oppressive way, but in a manner that made each breath feel significant, as though the very atmosphere had taken on a weight of its own. The faint hum of the lights became erratic, flickering in an uneven rhythm. A few people in the congregation exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing with every flicker. Gregory noticed it too. He turned his gaze upward, his smirk faltering for just a moment as he glanced at the lights. "Faulty wiring, Father?" he quipped, his voice cutting through the tension. But no one laughed. The priest said nothing, his lips moving in a silent prayer, his eyes fixed on the altar as though he was waiting for something. Then a sound. It started low, almost too soft to hear, like the faintest whisper carried on the wind. But it grew steadily, resonating through the church like the distant roll of thunder. The sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before, neither human nor mechanical, but something entirely otherworldly. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful, vibrating deep within the chest of everyone present. It felt as though the sound was not coming from one direction, but from everywhere at once, filling the entire space. Gregory's smirk disappeared entirely. He glanced around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it was futile. The congregation was frozen, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. Some clutched their rosaries tightly, their hands trembling, while others stared at the altar, their expressions a mix of awe and terror. "What is that?" Gregory demanded, his voice louder than it needed to be, as if he were trying to drown out the sound with his own bravado. But no one answered. Even Father Michael, who had been calm and composed throughout Gregory's provocation, looked visibly shaken. He gripped the edges of the altar, his knuckles white, his head bowed in what could only be described as reverence. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The chandeliers above swayed slightly, casting shifting shadows across the walls. And then, in a moment that felt like it stretched into eternity, the flickering stopped and the lights went out entirely. The church was plunged into darkness. Gasps filled the room, followed by the panicked murmurs of the congregation. But before fear could take hold completely, a soft glow began to emanate from the altar. It wasn't the harsh light of electricity, nor the warm flicker of a candle, but something entirely different. It was pure, radiant, and unearthly, casting long, ethereal shadows across the church walls. The glow seemed to pulse gently, almost like a heartbeat, as if it were alive. Gregory took a step back, his confidence now replaced with visible unease. "What kind of trick is this?" he demanded, his voice unsteady. But his bravado sounded hollow, a desperate attempt to maintain control in the face of something he couldn't understand. The congregation, on the other hand, was silent, their fear giving way to awe. Some fell to their knees, their hands clasped tightly in prayer, tears streaming down their faces. The sound intensified, now a chorus of tones that seemed to harmonize perfectly, creating a melody that resonated with the very soul. It was beautiful and overwhelming, a sound that felt like it carried centuries of meaning and emotion within it. And then, amidst the glow, something began to take shape. It wasn't a figure, nor was it something physical. It was more like a presence, a feeling that was both undeniable and indescribable. It filled the church with a sense of overwhelming power and love, a force that was both humbling and terrifying. Gregory stood frozen, his eyes wide, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to speak, to say something, but no words came. The confident, arrogant man who had stormed into the church moments earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked small and vulnerable. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his hands clutching the edge of a pew as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The glow pulsed brighter for a moment, filling the entire church with its radiance, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to fade. The lights returned, flickering back to life as though nothing had happened. The sound faded into silence, leaving only the soft hum of the church's electrical systems. The congregation remained silent, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Gregory sat on the floor, his head bowed, his hands trembling. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible, but those closest to him could hear the words. "I don't understand. What just happened?" Father Michael stepped forward, his expression calm but his eyes shining with something profound. He placed a hand on Gregory's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes, Mr. Fields, understanding is not what's required. Sometimes we are simply meant to witness." The church remained quiet, the weight of the moment lingering in the air. No one moved, no one spoke. For Gregory, the man who had come to challenge God, the world had just shifted in a way he could never have anticipated. And for the congregation, their faith had been reaffirmed in a way they would never forget. Gregory remained on the floor of the church, his breathing shallow and uneven. The confident, smug demeanor he had carried into the sacred space was gone, replaced by a man who seemed utterly lost. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the pew, knuckles white, his eyes unfocused as though he were staring into a reality only he could see. The congregation watched in silence, unsure whether to approach him or give him space. Even Father Michael hesitated, his own emotions torn between awe and concern for the man who had just experienced something extraordinary. The quiet hum of the church filled the space, a mundane contrast to the inexplicable events that had unfolded moments before. Gregory finally spoke, his voice barely audible, a strained whisper that seemed foreign even to him. What was that?" He didn't direct the question to anyone in particular. It was as though he were asking the universe itself. Father Michael stepped closer, his shoes making soft sounds against the polished floor. "Mr. Fields," he said gently, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of compassion. "Are you all right?" Gregory turned his head slightly, his expression one of disbelief and confusion. "What just happened to me?" he asked, his voice louder this time, though it trembled with uncertainty. That wasn't real. It couldn't have been. It's impossible." But even as he said the words, Gregory's tone lacked conviction. He knew, deep down, that what he had experienced was beyond anything he could explain. The glow, the sound, the overwhelming presence, it had felt more real than anything he had ever known. His rational mind fought desperately to assert control, to reduce the experience to something explainable, something logical. Yet, the memory of it lingered, undeniable and unshakable. "You felt something," Father Michael said, kneeling beside Gregory. "Something you cannot explain. That's all right. None of us can explain it. But you are not alone in this moment." Gregory shook his head, his movements jerky and frantic. "No," he said, his voice rising. "There has to be an explanation. A trick, some kind of group hysteria. This wasn't divine. It can't be divine. There's no God. I've spent my entire life proving that." The congregation remained silent, their eyes fixed on Gregory as he grappled with the weight of what had happened. For many, the sight of the once arrogant man reduced to a state of vulnerability was as impactful as the mysterious events themselves. Tears welled in the eyes of some of the faithful, their prayers whispered in gratitude for what they believed was a miracle. Gregory's breathing quickened as his mind raced. The logical part of him desperately sought answers. Was it an elaborate hoax? A hallucination? Perhaps he had been overwhelmed by the atmosphere, by the intensity of the moment. But even as he tried to rationalize the memory of that sound, the sound that had seemed to resonate within him, as if it were speaking directly to his soul, refused to be dismissed. It wasn't just external, it was inside him, and that terrified him more than anything. He looked up at Father Michael, his eyes wide and filled with something unfamiliar. Fear. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, his voice tinged with desperation. "What kind of trick are you playing here?" Father Michael shook his head slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "This was not a trick, Mr. Fields. What you experienced was not orchestrated by any human hand. I cannot tell you what it was, but I believe it was a response to your challenge." Gregory opened his mouth to argue, to refute, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew the priest was right. What he had felt was beyond the scope of human manipulation. It was raw, powerful, and utterly unexplainable. He lowered his head, his hands covering his face, his mind overwhelmed by the weight of his thoughts. The congregation began to stir, some moving closer to offer support. A woman approached with a rosary in her hand, her voice soft and soothing. "It's all right," she said gently. "You're not the first to question, and you won't be the last, but maybe you were meant to see." Gregory's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "See what?" he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "See that I've been wrong? That my entire worldview is a lie? Do you have any idea what you're asking me to accept?" "No one is asking you to accept anything," Father Michael interjected. "What you do with this experience is entirely up to you. Faith is not something forced upon anyone. It is something that grows, something that is nurtured. Right now, you are struggling, and that's all right. Struggle is part of the journey." Gregory let out a bitter laugh, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "Journey," he repeated, shaking his head. "You make it sound so easy. But this has turned my entire world upside down. I don't even know what's real anymore." Father Michael placed a comforting hand on Gregory's shoulder. "What you're feeling is natural, Mr. Fields. Doubt, fear, confusion, they are all part of being human. But I urge you not to dismiss this moment too quickly. Take the time to reflect, to seek understanding in your own way." For the first time in his life, Gregory felt small, not in the sense of insignificance, but in the sense of humility. He had always prided himself on his intellect, his ability to dissect and understand the world around him. But now, faced with an experience that defied everything he thought he knew, he realized how limited his perspective truly was. As the congregation began to disperse, many lingering to offer quiet prayers for Gregory, he remained seated on the floor, staring into the distance. He didn't know how to move forward, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to admit that he didn't have all the answers. And that, in itself, was a profound beginning. In the days following the incident at St. Mary's Church, Gregory Fields became a recluse, the man who had once thrived on attention and public debate, who basked in the limelight of controversy, now avoided all contact with the outside world. His estate, typically a hub of activity with staff and visitors coming and going, fell eerily silent. Friends, colleagues, and journalists who tried to reach him received no response. Gregory had locked himself away, consumed by the memory of what had happened. He spent hours replaying the events in his mind, trying desperately to make sense of them. His logical brain demanded answers, but every explanation he entertained felt inadequate. The glow, the sound, the presence, it defied everything he thought he knew about the universe. Was it a hallucination? A psychological response to the intensity of the moment? Or was it, he hesitated to even think the word, something divine? The possibility terrified him, not because it confirmed a higher power, but because it would mean that his entire belief system, the foundation of his identity, was flawed. In his desperation, Gregory turned to books, articles, and scientific studies. He devoured literature on neurological phenomena, mass hysteria, and even the psychological effects of religious experiences. But no matter how much he read, he couldn't find an explanation that fit. Every time he thought he had found a logical answer, the memory of that presence, its overwhelming power and undeniable reality, pushed his conclusions aside. It wasn't just something he had seen or heard, it was something he had felt deep within his very being. After a week of isolation, Gregory finally emerged, though he was far from the man he had been. His sharp suits were replaced by simple clothing, and the arrogant swagger in his step had been replaced by something more subdued. He avoided his usual haunts, the upscale restaurants, the exclusive clubs, the media studios where he had often debated matters of faith and reason. Instead, he found himself drawn back to St. Mary's Church. The first time he returned, it was late at night, long after the evening service had ended. The church was quiet, the pews empty, the only light coming from the flickering candles near the altar. Gregory stood in the doorway for a long time, hesitant, unsure of what had brought him there. Finally, he stepped inside, the soft sound of his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. He sat in the back pew, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his gaze fixed on the altar. For hours he sat in silence, lost in thought. He didn't pray, at least not in the traditional sense. He didn't even know how to begin. But as he sat there, he felt a sense of peace that he couldn't explain. It wasn't the overwhelming presence he had felt during the incident, but something quieter, gentler. It was as though the church itself was embracing him, offering solace without demanding anything in return. The next morning, Father Michael found him there, still seated in the same spot. The priest approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. "Mr. Fields," he said gently, "you've been here all night." Gregory looked up, his eyes weary but calm. "I didn't mean to," he admitted. I didn't know where else to go." Father Michael nodded and sat beside him. "You're searching," he said. "That's a good place to start." Gregory sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I don't know what I'm searching for," he confessed. "Answers, maybe. Understanding. Or maybe just some kind of peace." "You're not alone in that," Father Michael said. "Many people come here for the same reasons. Faith is not about having all the answers, Gregory. It's about being willing to seek them, even when the journey is difficult." Gregory shook his head. "I spent my whole life tearing down faith, mocking people who believed in something I thought was ridiculous. And now..." He trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. "Now, I don't know what to believe." Father Michael placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Faith is not a straight path," he said. "It's a winding road, filled with questions, doubts, and struggles. But every step, even the uncertain ones, is part of the journey." Over the following weeks, Gregory began attending services regularly. At first, he stayed in the back, slipping in quietly and leaving before anyone could approach him. But as time went on, he grew more comfortable. He began to participate in the prayers, to listen attentively to the sermons, and to engage in conversations with members of the congregation. He didn't always agree with what he heard. His skeptical nature hadn't disappeared entirely, but he found himself drawn to the sense of community and the hope that faith offered. Gregory also spent hours in private discussions with Father Michael. The two men debated theology, philosophy, and science, often late into the night, Father Michael never pressured Gregory to believe, instead encouraging him to explore his questions honestly and openly. "Faith is not the absence of doubt," he told Gregory one evening. "It's the willingness to keep searching, even when you're uncertain." Gradually, Gregory began to change. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations of conversion, no sudden embrace of religious dogma. Instead, it was a quiet, subtle shift. He became more introspective, more compassionate, more open to the possibility that there was something greater than himself. He started volunteering at the church's outreach programs, using his wealth to support charitable initiatives and help those in need. The congregation, once skeptical of the man who had challenged God in their sanctuary, began to welcome him with open arms. Many saw his journey as a testament to the power of faith, a reminder that even the most hardened hearts could be touched by grace. For Gregory, it was less about finding definitive answers and more about embracing the mystery of it all. He no longer needed to prove or disprove anything. He had found peace in simply being part of something greater. Years later, when people asked Gregory about that fateful day in St. Mary's Church, he would smile and shake his head. "I still don't know what happened," he would say, "but maybe I don't need to." Sometimes the most powerful experiences are the ones we can't explain. They remind us that there's more to this world than what we can see or understand, and maybe that's enough.